Welcome to this ordinary meeting of Hunters Hill Council number 4480 on this evening, June 9, 2020. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and the waters that surround us, and I pay my respect to elders past and present.
We thank you, Lord, for the honour of being called by our fellow citizens to this office of honour and trust. Give us grace, diligently and honourably, free from private interest or prejudice, to discharge the duties entrusted to us, to the common good, and as in your sight, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. I don't think we have any apologies this evening. Are there any declarations of interest, please, councillors? Councillor McLaughlin.
Yes, I have a non-significant, non-pecuniary interest in items 4.3 and 4.4, as some of those applicants are known to me.
Thank you, councillor. Are there any other declarations? No? Very good. I'll move to the confirmation of the minutes of the last meeting. Move Councillor Williams. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Miles. Thank you, Councillor Miles. Everybody in favour? That's carried. Thank you. Are there any matters arising from those minutes you wish to discuss, councillors? All right, we move to item 4.1. Unfortunately, a number of us weren't available for the...
Sorry, 3.1.
Oh, 3.1, is it?
Yeah.
Sorry, I've gone right past one, I'm sorry. 3.1.
Notice of motion, Councillor Williams.
Yep. Skip right over it. Here we go. Councillor Williams moved. Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Crassoy. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this issue. It's a very important issue, and we're dealing with major matters relating to heritage and our protection of heritage in Hunters Hill. What is being proposed here, and do I need to read out the recommendation, or it was published and whatever?
I don't think you do need to read it, but is there anybody who would like Councillor Williams to read it out?
Yep, okay, I'll read it.
One moment. Councillor Crassoy? Could we unmute Councillor Crassoy?
There's a speaker for this one too.
Oh. I think we have a speaker for this item, Councillor Williams. I'm sorry. Just one moment.
Okay.
Councillor Crassoy, did you have another issue? No, that was she was just reminding me, I think. So, Christina, could you read that, please? Thank you.
This is a speaker, it's Dr. Alistair Sharp, and who is a supporter. And he says, curb and gutter policy, conservation and heritage sandstone. Some recent work inappropriately replaced sandstone curbs and gutters in Bladesville Road with concrete. The very fact that they were of sandstone indicates that they date from the early history of Hunters Hill and still a part of our heritage and fall under various requirements to be conserved. The website of the New South Wales Department of Environment states, built heritage is one of our most important cultural assets. It represents the historical layers of our built environment. It helps to define a sense of place and identity for a community. It can contribute to feelings of connectedness and community pride and confidence. In Hunters Hill's Community Strategic Plan of 2019, the first item listed under what we've learned from you, priority services that you want council to focus on, is preservation of heritage and character. As Councillor Williams notes, one of the stated aims of Hunters Hill's LEP 2012 is to conserve Aboriginal heritage and European heritage that influence the character and identity of the municipality. Our DCP mentions curbs and gutters specifically, stating, Heritage items and heritage conservation areas often include elements which contribute to the municipality's historic character and identity, such as trees, sandstone walls, curbs and gutters, culverts and steps. So, as these four sources confirm, there is no doubt that Hunters Hill sandstone curbs and gutters are of heritage importance and therefore should be conserved. To eliminate future misunderstandings and ensure that they are conserved, it seems quite appropriate to adopt a specific policy of the nature detailed in the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharp. Councillor Williams, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think Dr. Sharp, as the president of the Hunters Hill Trust, has summed up some of the issues that I was going to raise very well. So I won't necessarily go over those, but there's a couple of minor typos in the recommendation, the report I'd just like to make sure rectified. And if I read it out, it's probably better. That before any further works be carried out on sandstone curb and gutters, and it should be a bracket, singly, and it should be or, not of, or combined, that is being either curb or both curb and gutter, or just curb, gutter. In the municipality, the following process be undertaken. Council develop a policy to protect and conserve our unique and historically important sandstone curb and gutter. Council conduct an audit of the sandstone curb and gutter to produce a register of location, condition and maintenance regime. Council nominate these as heritage items for listing as a local, state or national significant places as appropriate. That doesn't mean they're all, it just means we need to consider them as and where appropriate we move forward. Council develop guidelines and protocols for managing and restoring these curb and gutters. Advice be sought from Council's Conservation Advisory Panel as to the important attributes and heritage considerations needed in developing a policy and guidelines and protocols. And obviously the final policy and guidelines would need to go on public exhibition. Now,
Councillor, do I have a seconder for that? Do we have a seconder? Councillor Crasoy. Please go ahead, Councillor Williams.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. In addition to those 4 points that Dr. Sharp raised in his presentation to Council, we need to be mindful that all through our driving documents, reference is made to the importance of heritage and the need for us to work to ensure that it's conserved and is passed on to other generations. Even in our recent LSPS, in Action 8.3, page 71, it clearly states as an action, review heritage program and update heritage planning documents and resources to ensure best practice heritage management approach. We also need to be mindful that these curb and gutterings are already listed on the state register. They are already recognised as being important heritage items in New South Wales. And like many aspects of heritage, Hunters Hill is very fortunate and indeed the custodian of a lot of heritage that is significant. And we have a lot of, or not a lot, we have many significant curb and guttering or just curb located throughout the municipality. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that we use our state-of-the-art asset management system, which is national leading and local government being able to identify, measure, manage and schedule assets, to push the button and pull up all our curb and guttering and all the issues associated for that that's related to sandstone curbs. I think that's a very easy process for council to do, so we know exactly where they are. We can then work through the process of guidelines and protocols. And I've listed further on in my report that there are already published in state government documentation what are the management processes that need to be followed in relation to in relation to sandstone curb and guttering and its importance in maintenance. Those two elements really give us our policy, give us our driving factors that we need to consider when we're dealing with these important assets. They are places that reveal the story of Australia's past. They safeguard and enrich our present and our future. The communities, heritage plays a major role in the appeal and life of neighbourhoods. I don't think I need to go on quoting. There's dozens of quotes that show that these items are important. So why do we need a policy? It's evident that we don't have a coherent or consistent approach, or one that is publicly available anyway, in the way we deal with these important heritage items. For instance, we've had at great length in Alexandra Street, curbs pulled up and then placed appropriately back. But then you go to Gladesville Road and there's been a large track of curb that is historic sandstone that has been removed and lost in terms of its heritage character. So there seems to be some inconsistency there in how we're treating these items. And I think a policy will give us some clarity and some guidance as to what is the best practice and how we should approach these items when we're dealing with assets. So to make sure that we don't lose any more of our curbs that are sandstone, it is appropriate that we just put a moratorium on these items until we go through a process which will be low cost, which will not take much time to pull together, but very critical and important in preserving and ensuring these assets. For example, the ones in Gladesville Road, I just was keen to have a look at what the Heritage Advisor or report was. But as I've said in the last meeting when we're dealing with the Chamber, heritage is a multi-dimensional issue. It is not just the condition of the asset. It's about the context. It's about the history. It's about the
Councillor Williams, your 5 minutes is up. Is there a move to extend, please? Councillor Sanderson, seconded Councillor McLaughlin, all in favour. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be brief. Yeah, so there's all those 4 aspects: social, fabric, context, and historic. And that curb met all those. For people that aren't aware, that curb represents a row of houses that used to be there before Joey's took over that location. It also represented an important part in our transport history. It provided a very robust curb and gutter for 150 years. It also told the story about the houses that used to be there and the communities that used to live there. And equally importantly, it told a story about the relationship it has or had with the sandstone wall, which is a vital part of that streetscape. So by moving it away from there, it's lost any relevance and just becomes a sandstone block, which to me is a lost opportunity and a lost future for our community in interpreting our history and what has gone on. So, Mr. Mayor, I see this as a very low cost process, one that we have a lot of the data already available. The best practice is available from the state government, and it's a matter for us to work with groups like the Conservation Advisory Panel to ensure that we have the appropriate policy and protocols in place to ensure that these important attributes and aspects of our heritage are there for the future. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there anybody wishing to speak against the recommendation there on page 1? Councillor Miles. Just one moment. We'll unlock you. Councillor Miles.
I'm not speaking against the intention of the motion, which is that we want to maintain and preserve as much of the sandstone curb and gutter as we can. But what's not addressed here is in the first part of the motion, it says that prior to any other works being carried out, that all these things need to be done. And equally, there are issues in parts of the question, parts of the motion about work that's already being done, and I certainly am not supportive of heritage listing curbs and gutters. I mean, I think that's erring on the side of ridiculousness. A couple of questions I might ask first through you to the Manager of Public Works. Given that we've just undertaken a fairly substantial audit of our assets, and we've developed an asset management plan, point 2 in the motion, conduct an audit of sandstone curb and gutter and produce a register of location, condition, etc. Is that something that we can pull directly out of the current asset management plan that's been done already?
For you, General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the Director. No.
Sorry. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that's correct. We have got condition audit completed, and we're aware of the location of the sandstone curb and gutter.
And just to that, as a general rule, as you have done on Alexandria Street, where that curb and gutter is able to be replaced, it's our policy to replace it.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. So we've just completed Alexandria Street, and we intend to follow the same procedure for other locations.
Thank you.
Given that is the case, and council has been doing that, I understand Councillor Williams's point about Gladesville Road, but given that it's been done on Alexandria Street and the commitment's been made that we would do this in other parts of the municipality, and given that point 2 has already been completed and is part of our asset management plan, I just don't see the point in specifically in drawing up a policy guideline for something that's already being done, and particularly hampering the capacity of us to do much needed public works by heritage listing items that can only be worked on by council's own engineers. So, I mean, if the council's got a policy of retaining these items, I think heritage listing gutters is a little over the top. I mean, I as a preference prefer to have sandstone gutters where possible, but you know, in certain circumstances, they're cost prohibitive. I don't know of a great deal of sandstone gutters in areas in Hunters Hill, Gladesville, for example, where there is much needed works that need to be done. So to spend a lot of money restoring curbs and guttering that will need obviously a lot more capex to be replaced, when we've got a backlog and have started to have a thought-based process of restoring our assets, just seems to be not only cost prohibitive, but seems to hamper our council staff's capacity to do their job. This is something that's being done already, and it's they're items, quite frankly, that only council can work on. So heritage listing something that we are going to work on doesn't seem logical to me. Anyway.
Thank you, Councillor. So you are speaking against the recommendation as it is. So is anybody wishing to speak for the recommendation? Councillor Crassoy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think Councillor Williams has spoken well, and certainly Dr. Sharp as well. So I actually just wanted to clarify a couple of things that Councillor Miles raised just for my own benefit. In the audit, are the sandstone curbs and gutters listed separately, or like that was a sub through you, Mr. Mayor, to the General Manager? Was that a suburb-wide audit of all our curbs and gutters and their state of repair? But if you wanted to specifically look at sandstone curbs and gutters, is there can that be peeled out easily as a separate item?
General Manager.
Yeah. Through Mr. Mayor to the Director.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. We have audited all of the curb and gutter, and we've extracted the sandstone locations, so we can review them on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. And also through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Williams, at point 3, there's the point that the items be nominated as heritage items, blah, 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 as appropriate. So, for example, if the Director found that there was a section of sandstone curb or gutter that was dangerous or had to be replaced, or wasn't of significant heritage link to a particular part of the suburb. Is that what you're saying by as appropriate, or is that as appropriate related to the local, state or national body?
Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, it's as appropriate, meaning after you've assessed them from a heritage perspective and from the protocol and guidelines for how you would deal with any deficiencies there, and in conjunction with the Conservation Advisory Panel, would come to an understanding as to what was needed. And in relation to the process, the preferred management or best management practice clearly states that there are efficiencies in reusing the sandstone, and there are techniques for ensuring that the sandstone is still retaining its heritage. And I noted in the council's budget papers that replacement with sandstone for curbs is only marginally more expensive than from a material perspective than from concrete. So yes, you would only have listed those that meet the criteria and are appropriate. And I would think that our Conservation Advisory Panel give us good advice as to where those particular items sit within the spectrum of listing and of importance.
Thank you. And so then just one last question, if I might, on item 3, through you, Mr. Mayor, and General Manager might direct it, I'm not quite sure where. If council didn't see fit to list a particular item, let's say, for example, had we done this a year ago and council had decided that they wouldn't be listing the curb outside Joey's on Gladesville Road as a heritage item, my understanding of heritage is that anyone can nominate something to be listed as a heritage item. And so even if council didn't do that, a member of the community or the trust or someone could actually put forward a nomination for something to be listed as a heritage item. I'm not sure who can answer that, but I'll go through you, Mr. Mayor, and see where you go with it.
To the General Manager, thank you.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I'll hand over to the Director in a second, but just to explain that the current process is that when the works team go out to do works on sandstone curbs, they seek advice from the Heritage Advisor, our consultant, and that based on that advice, that informs the techniques that they use on that particular stretch of curb. So in relation to Gladesville Road, the sandstone was in such condition that it was crumbling and it wasn't possible to retain. With the works in Alexandra Street, the sandstone was in good condition. The issue that was being addressed through the works was an issue of drainage. So it was possible to lift the stone, undertake the works and lower the stone. Again, that was done in consultation with the heritage consultant. And that's the way that the works team will work with the heritage experts and our own planning people. I'll ask the director to talk about the process to list. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor. Yeah, councillors, you're correct in saying that anybody can lodge a planning proposal, which is a rezoning application, the old term, to the local environmental plan. So anybody can lodge a planning proposal to amend the LEP. To do such, you need to identify what the issue is, have heritage statement to identify what the importance of that identification is, and for it to be retained, to go through that planning proposal to amend the LEP, you've got to go through the Environmental Planning Assessment Act, which follows an exhibition process, a reporting process, comes back to council whether or not they want to adopt it, to amend it. Then you'll definitely, assuming it's a positive, will go to the Department of Planning, where the Minister signs off on the amendment to the LEP. We're looking about 8 to 12 months on an average, and costs, say, if that's individual, but it costs council with regard to hours of staff and also exhibition period, an estimate of $30,000 to $50,000 for an amendment to the LEP. It's a time taken, exhibition and paperwork preparing. We have, that's a standard process that we follow.
Councillor Crasso, does that answer all of your questions?
If I could, because it actually just raised one more question, and so I would like to clarify that. If we include item 3 in this motion, every gutter that we want to list as a heritage item will cost us $30,000 to $50,000 each time. Is that what you're saying?
No, sorry, apologise. The whole package, the whole process was roughly 30 to 50 for that sort of amendment to the LEP. Because you need
through you, Mr. Mayor, again, if a resident chose to nominate an item to be heritage listed, who bears that cost?
Well, the resident will have to bear that cost, but there's exhibition processes and costs associated by council. So we're looking at around about $10,000 to $15,000 cost.
Through.
All right.
Just before we go, I'll pass back to the General Manager. General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if we can provide, we'll take the process on notice, and we can provide further detail to the councillors on that and the resourcing involved.
Councillor Crasso, does that answer all of your questions?
It does. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Do you wishing to speak for the recommendation?
Mr. Mayor, I'm concerned now about item 3 and the cost implication of that for council. And while I believe that I'm not sure if I'm talking for it anymore, because I believe that every other point in the motion is still important from a retaining our corporate history, so that whatever general managers and directors and councillors are on our council in the future, there is a policy to guide them and us. I'm concerned about the cost implications of item 3. And I feel that for the council to make a decision on this motion, we really do need to have a better understanding of what this would cost us.
All right. So are you suggesting an amendment, or do you foreshadowing
Perhaps I'm foreshadowing that if the motion's lost, I would suggest that a report be brought back to council on the implications, the cost implications of doing this well, developing a policy. Because it's not budgeted anywhere.
Could we come back to that and give? Sorry, could we come back to that and give you an opportunity to formulate a foreshadowed motion? We'll come back to you if it's lost. So, is there? Do I have a councillor who wishes to speak for the recommendation? Councillor Sanderson, do you wish to speak for the recommendation? Hold on just one moment. We'll unmute you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I do wish to speak for the motion, but I do have one question, and that would be through you, I expect, to the Director for Development Control. The
General Manager?
Whoever. But I would have thought that, given we have we'll be producing a new LLP fairly soon, that, a proposal like that could be bundled up with a lot of other things. So the that 30 or to 50,000 or whatever it is, I expect could be amortised over a number of items rather than just this. So I wonder whether that can be clarified before we go further as to whether it's necessary to amend 3.
General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, 2 comments. In terms of enshrining the process, we have an operational management statement which guides the operations of how works will do their work. So when it comes to sandstone, so in terms of that continuity that was raised, we have operational procedures rather than a policy in how we deal with the curbs. In relation to the cost of, as mentioned before, we'll bring back a further report, Councillor Sanderson, to clarify that and what those costs might look like.
Councillor Sanderson, do you wish to speak to the recommendation, or for the recommendation rather?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Mayor, I would. I think one of the things that comes out of this is that you know, maintenance of gutters is and curbs and so on is essential. We've had sandstone in this municipality for a long time, and if you would allow me to reminisce, I can recall at the age of about 10 seeing all of the sandstone, or sandstone, which at that stage the gutter levels are far lower, and you know, they had quite a lot of sandstone in them because it was both gutter and curb. I can recall that being dug up very carefully, and a local contractor, I believe his business name was John James, but you know, as slang was used in those days, he was known as Jimmy James. And there was a bit of debate over that expense at that time, but that restoration of the sandstone in Woolwich Road was incredibly important. That occurred in the early 1960s. It preceded the battlers that saved Kelly's Bush. It was the starting point of this municipality's real understanding of heritage. In the long run, the money that the council at that time spent was well worthwhile. It started a process where other gutters have had their sandstone works retained, and it's essential that we continue to do it. As for the present processes, we've clearly had a failure in Gladesville Road. We could have got a better outcome. I think with a policy like this in place, it gives us an opportunity to more carefully examine the work that we do, and it is an incredibly important aspect of our heritage. It's a bit sad when you hear councillors dismissing things as being, oh, well, it's not heritage. It was back in the 1980s or something. Heritage comes from all times, and the history and the work that's gone in with our gutters through this very sensible restoration that occurred in the early 1960s is an ongoing process. I think Councillor Williams' excellent motion does keep that process ongoing. It's important also we involve our Conservation Advisory Panel. I'm one of 4 current councillors who's had the great privilege of being a member of that panel. And I've witnessed the great work that the experts we have on that committee do. It is amazing in those meetings to see that knowledge being able to explain to people the importance of heritage, and that a lot of the applicants that come in, if they're willing to listen, will learn a lot about the process. The other thing about gutters is that the heritage listing is incredibly important because, we had situations, I think Councillor McLaughlin spoke to me about one of them. In the end, we didn't have any sandstone in Passy Avenue, but having sandstone in particular streets does have an implication. It's part of an overall package where there are other heritage items there. So I'm very supportive of Councillor Williams' motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there anybody wishing to speak against the recommendation there? Councillor Collins, just one moment. Councillor Collins.
Thank you. Look, I don't disagree with the sentiment of it. I think we're all a little shocked about Gladesville Road, but hearing the explanation that it was the sandstone was not able to be saved, I think pretty much explains it. We've got, from what I understand, the policies now are that the preference is to keep the sandstone curbs if if that's actually practical, and if it's not, then obviously they have to be replaced. I think at this stage we now have a good idea about everything that needs to be done, and we do have to do a lot, not just on curbs, but footpaths and roads. And I think something like this could just wrap a lot of process around what we need to do. So if we were of a mind to do something like this, I think that would be better revisited after we have received all the information about our asset review and we understand what needs to be done. I think now's not the stage to wrap all this up in another process. So whilst I agree with the sentiment of it, I think the method is wrong, because it's really just it's going to be cost prohibitive. It's going to cost a lot of money. We don't have a funding source for this. I'm not sure we can even really pass this without a funding source, because it's going to cost a lot of money for council to go over this. You know, if we're talking about doing a review, I know a lot of the information's there. Develop a policy. You know, there's nothing that I understand that's in the budget for this particular project, and we couldn't. I don't see how we could pass this without a funding source identified. So yeah, what I would suggest is that if this is to be done, that it not be done right now. We will know in a couple of months where all the sandstone curbs are. We can keep an eye on where what the works list is, and then perhaps we might be better informed rather than doing a blanket curb strategy when, to be honest, we haven't really been briefed on it's an operational issue about how the curbs are replaced in the process there. Without having all that information, I would suggest that we are really crossing into operational territory, probably not as informed as we all should be on the detail of how these processes play out. And I think it could, I just think it could spend a lot of time and resources for not much value. That said, I think it's something we all need to be very mindful of. And I'm glad to hear that this review will identify the sandstone curbs, so we can all just be aware of where they are, and make sure that in the asset renewal program that we ultimately adopt, that they are well catered for and treated with the respect they deserve.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Councillor Collins, are you foreshadowing a motion, given that the motion is lost, to delay this for a period of time? Is that what you're suggesting?
Look, no, I don't think there's necessarily a foreshadow motion, because then it becomes on the table. I think it's good that we've all discussed this. We're all aware of it. We know that there is a process in place to protect these gutters as they are. Once we know exactly where they are, how much we have to do, we're probably better informed to adopt a blanket strategy. But I would certainly like some staff input before we wrap up the operational processes that they've already got in place with what we've essentially got here. So I wouldn't foreshadow it, but I would encourage Councillor Williams to maybe bring it back later in the year, once we've got our head around what needs to be done, or perhaps in that process where we adopt the new asset management review, then maybe we can provide for you know, some protections for these curbs. But I will obviously say that I think everybody having expressed their strong view that these curbs should be protected where they can, I think the message is pretty clear that we value them, and I think staff would obviously take that on board in any decisions they have to make in the next 6 months anyway. So no foreshadow motion, but maybe we save it for another day.
All right, thank you, councillor. Anybody wishing to speak in favour of the recommendation in the motion? Councillor McLaughlin. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm broadly I completely agree with Councillor Williams' assessment of how we need to treat the curb and guttering in our municipality. And I'm completely persuaded by the Office of the Environment and Heritage and their statement of significance on the curb and guttering. So they have identified sandstone curb and guttering as being of extreme importance for heritage throughout Sydney and wider. I agree with the recommendation. I'm just wondering if perhaps in relation to point 3, we might, whether Councillor Williams and the seconder would be willing to accept an amendment along the lines that a report be brought back to council outlining options for the appropriate heritage listing of the curbs and gutters. That might address some of the issues around whether or not this needs to be included in a separate LEP application, or I mean, to my mind, if we are going to be doing redoing the LEP at some point, it simply becomes part of that process. And therefore, as Councillor Sanderson pointed out, it is absorbed into that process and those costs. I don't see that it's so urgent that it needs to be outside of another process. So I'm just wondering if Councillor Williams would be willing to accept that amendment.
Councillor Williams?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'd be happy to accept that.
All right. So the words that we would use, Councillor McLaughlin, and with Councillor Williams' review of the words. Does that look correct to you, Councillor McLaughlin?
Perhaps we should we put in sandstone curbs and gutters? I don't know, maybe yes. Sandstone, not all of the curbs and gutters.
Yes.
Sure. Councillor Williams.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that. I think that's a fair point.
All right. Councillor McLaughlin, do you wish to speak further?
Just to point out that while I understand that some of the points in the recommendation are already underway, I think rather than to muddy all of this, I think we should just keep the recommendation as it is with that one amendment. And I think that just covers some of the issues around the funding.
I think the seconder was Councillor Crasso. Is that correct, Councillor Crasso? Are you in agreement with that amendment? Very good, thank you. Is anybody wishing to speak against? Councillor Collins, do you have a question?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
With a question through you, Mr. Mayor, the General Manager, with that taken out, with number 3, as I understand that was taken out, just with 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, that sounds like quite a big process. Do you have an estimate of the cost of that process, and do you have a funding source for it? I know it's a bit hard to do that on the fly, but I mean, we're talking about going on public exhibition, so that's a pretty meaty process. So could you maybe shed some light on that?
General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, as mentioned, we currently have a process or a procedure from an operational perspective. I'd need to just take that on notice, Councillor Collins, and work out the time frame. And it would be more a staff resource rather than a direct cost, but can come back to you with that. But a lot of the procedure's already there, and we can put that out for exhibition.
Councillor Collins.
Okay, so you're suggesting that it won't cost, okay, so it's already done.
Pretty much.
Well, okay, interesting. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, councillor. Anybody wishing to speak for? Against? So can I put the amended recommendation, councillors? I'll put the amended recommendation. Those in favour? Councillor McLaughlin, you have something you... Councillor McLaughlin, one moment.
Just a point of order. Councillor Williams didn't get a right of reply.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Councillor Williams, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. There was a couple of issues that were raised during the debate that I'd probably like to put a perspective on. As we've heard, and I think it was Councillor Miles that made reference that this is not an important issue and while we're tying it all up, it is an important issue and it is recognised as an important issue at a state level and at a federal level, but particularly at state level, where they do list sandstone curb and guttering, and they do believe it has significance. And I believe Hunters Hill is custodian of a considerable amount of this type of heritage. We need to be very mindful and provide leadership in the way that we're going to deal with these important and significant items. So I don't believe it's trivial. I believe it's crucial, and it shows leadership by the council, and it's walk the talk. We sit in judgment of our residents when they bring forward proposals for heritage, where it affects heritage. And we're very clear and we're very transparent in the way we do that process. And I believe council, there is confusion out there as to how council is dealing with sandstone curb and guttering. And a simple policy that builds on whatever operational activities would give clarity to our community and provide transparency, and more importantly, show that we're prepared to lead on this issue. Council does have heritage items in its control, the town hall for one. So it's not right to say that council has no role to play in this, or it's the only player in it. We're part of a bigger picture in terms of heritage on many stages and on many levels. And I think we need to be seen to be leading that process. I think this should be an informer of the asset review process, not a follower. It's important for us to know what the outcomes and requirements are in relation to this particular type of asset. In terms of cost, as I've said here specifically, that there is minimal cost associated with this process, and it's been pointed out that any subsequent inclusion in our LEP would be caught up or taken up in the bigger process that we've got to do anyway. And we could do this as a job lot. Now, in terms of reports, in terms of drafting, that is minimal as well. I've already put in what the best practice guidelines are for managing these assets. There's 4 points. It's not a complicated thing, but it's important to state and articulate those points in a formal way, not just an operational way. So all the elements are there. And I think as the chair of the Conservation Advisory Panel, we have the capacity, rather than going out to consultants, to make use of that expertise and to make more use of that expertise. They can contribute significantly to our processes and would be willing to do that. And I might add, the Hunters Hill Trust may be a very willing partner in this process. And as we're dealing with significant heritage items, I'm sure we could look towards the state government processes and agencies and grants to help us along this path. So I don't see this as being a costly process. It's one that piggybacks on a whole range of things that are already occurring in council, which I can see. But I think it's very critical for us to provide a clear, transparent policy for how we deal with these particular items. And I might add, there's a whole range of other things that we need to be developing best practice for and looking at into the future as well in terms of the way we manage heritage. And I bring us back to action 8.3 on page 71 in our recently adopted LSPS, that we need to review heritage program and update heritage planning documents and resources to ensure best practice heritage management approach is in place. And that's all I'm asking for here. Minimal cost, engagement with our conservation advisory panel that will end up giving us information that we'll need in terms of our asset review. It will give us information in terms of how the community understands and interprets what we're doing with these important assets. So it's a big step at a small cost and a small impost on council. So I commend this recommendation as being an important step in us protecting as custodians of this heritage.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Against? That's carried. Two objectors, Councillor Miles, Councillor Collins. Thank you. We move on to 4.1 this time, and we have a number of speakers for that. Could I also suggest, councillors, we take a 5-minute break at 8 p.m? Could I just check with you in favour of that, councillors? 5-minute break at 8 p.m? All in favour? Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, I don't think the speakers are in relation to 4.1, they'd be in relation to 4.2. 4.1 is just a note and adopt.
I have a speaker listed against 4.1.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, it's just a committee. It's just a committee report. I would have thought any speakers would want to talk to the 4.2.
Just a point of clarification.
They actually address both, so they're actually on 4.2.
Okay, they're listed as 4.1, but we'll. Okay. The advice I've just got is we should take them to 4.2. Thank you. 4.1, the recommendation is there to receive a note. Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Miles, I think I saw. Sorry, I'm a bit slow. Is there any discussion required, councillors? Councillor Williams, do you wish to say anything?
I think it'll all be covered and revealed in the next item, Mr. Mayor.
Right, thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. 4.2. And we have Mr. Ian Holswich. Is that correct? Is that the right first speaker? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Ian Holswich is an objector and says, firstly, I hope all submissions not selected to suit the agenda Council receives under COVID-19 lockdown are read out and incorporated in consideration of this flawed report, which is being rushed through and was not even given a courtesy notification via letterbox drop to affected people. I did receive an email 1 working day prior to the meeting from Council's Bushland Coordinator, Jackie Bolner, suggesting the flood study has been finalised following analysis of submissions received during the public exhibition period, and the agenda for the meeting will be available on the Council's website. Agenda being the operative word, as the Council's website did not have anything regarding this on Council's website last Friday afternoon, leading into the Queen's Birthday long weekend, when COVID restrictions allowed people to travel for this first time. Hunters Hill Council was first proclaimed in January 1861, over 159 years ago, and has not had any flooding in at least alleged hotspot 6. If there has been flooding in the past 159 years,
it would have been documented and attended to out of the funds from Section 94 developer contributions Council has received for infrastructure purposes. I request proper process be adopted, and along with a dropping this exercise or extension of time, which Council seems to be capable of doing as demonstrated in 10 items as below ordinary meeting of Hunters Hill Council 9th of June 2020. It is important to note, I sent a submission to Council on 18th of November 2019 regarding this matter, which included Council's flood survey lacks vital items, namely, no detailed site-specific contour drawings, does not consider the site-specific contours of the land, design and location of the existing stormwater drainage network is not accurate. See second attachment. Incorrect pipe locations and pipe sizes being contemplated. See second attachment. Consideration not given of any rainwater detention tanks, basins, containment upstream. Does not have a survey of critical items that will alter the flow of water, such as existing walls, boundary fences and structures. The above would result in the findings being inadequate. For example, if there was a site-specific consider of my property, it would show the long existing concrete boundary walls. The existence of the wall would remove the likelihood of any flood. The boundary side walls would deflect any suggested stormwater and thus not come into our property. I again sent an email in February 2020 identifying no flooding or remote evidence of flooding with the 8-9 February 2020 peak storms over a 1-week period, worst in 30 years as. Okay, and then Mr. Holdsworth sends through a copy of the email sent on the 13th of February.
Just a short extension, councillors, all in agreement? Thank you. Go ahead.
Good morning, Councillor and Deputy Mayor Jim Sanderson. Just to follow up on the alleged hotspot 6 pursuant to the massive rain experienced last weekend. At no time during these worst storms Sydney has experienced in 30 years was there flooding to ours or neighbouring properties. Thanks again for your time, and we trust this draft flood report could be dropped. As proven in last weekend's devastating storms not affecting our properties, we do not want any hint of our property being in or gazetted as flood prone land. I am available by phone or email anytime and can attend a council meeting with 24 hours notice of the same. And Mr. Holdsworth, which also goes on to note ordinary meeting of Hunters Hill Council 9th of June, where it actually talks in relation to the Floodplain Risk Management Committee that was to be adopted. The report includes GRC Hydro dismissed the recent 8-9 February 2020 peak with storms over a 1-week period, the worst in 30 years. Hunters Hill Council was first, which we've actually gone through, Hunters Hill Council was first proclaimed in January 1861, 159 years ago, and has not had any flooding in at least alleged hotspot 6. If there had been any flooding in the past 159 years, it would have been documented and attended to out of the funds from the relevant 94 developer contributions, which actually Council has received for infrastructure purposes. The only work we are aware that the corner of Woodward Road and Ellesmere had drainage updated in 1957, and the upgraded drainage, which include a 30% increase in pipe size, which also will have more than 100% increase on the flow volume. And in addition to this, the straightening of the drainage line to further increase flow rate was not included in the report. Notification was not carried out, which should have included at a minimum for something so major a letterbox drop. The affected 188 properties should have been notified in due process for something so major to make people aware of the potential damage this could do to properties. Council Section 149 certificates and approved developments in the alleged floodplains have not suggested any flooding or design requirements with the 159-year history of the suggested area. Thank you.
That's a presentation by Mr. Ian Holswich. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another presentation by Mr. Aaron Goonry.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Goonry is also an objector, and his report reads, proper individual consultation. We request that consideration of the relevant report, including any proposed adoption or otherwise, be postponed. In our view, there has not been any proper consultation regarding the report or recommended consequences of the report. The flood study should also be updated to reflect the recent works before the imposition of any conditions, including section 10.7. Given the significant impact that the recommendations are likely to have on the properties in question, we would appreciate further and individual consultation with the relevant property owners, and that the flood study be updated before any actions taken. Thank you.
That's Mr. Goonry. Thank you very much. Ms. Pattinson.
Thank you. Also an objector, Ms. Pattinson says, postponement of any endorsement of flood study. We strongly oppose any action, adoption, endorsement or otherwise by Hunters Hill Council on the Hunters Hill LGA flood study, item 4.2. We strongly recommend that this item be postponed immediately to ensure that there will be fair, reasonable and meaningful and transparent consultation conducted, including using the correct source data of stormwater assets on our property. To date, there has been no consultation nor even response to our submission on 20 November 2019. And in our view, a lack of transparency by Council throughout this process to date. Both the lack of consultation and the lack of transparency by Council are deeply concerning given the significant potential detrimental impact to our property value, increased insurance premiums and development opportunities. Specifically, there has been 1, a complete lack of any consultation with us by Council, no receipt of any communication prior to notification from Hunters Hill Council on 4th of October 2019, stating our property has been identified as being in a preliminary flood planning area. No receipt of any survey or questionnaire and no offer for participation in or even knowledge of any community group consultation opportunity. No response to our submission to the public exhibition of the flood study on the 20th of November 2019, which highlighted the GRC study was based on incorrect data, being an old, much narrower, decommissioned stormwater pipe on our property. No response to our urgent request for a dial before you dig on the 5th of November 2019 to ascertain what assets Council think are on our property due to the discrepancy in source information in regards to the stormwater pipe. No response to our submission that the stormwater drainage on the corner of Ellesmere Avenue and Tukuya Road is completely inadequate and actually causes flooding, the repair and maintenance of which is clearly Council's responsibility. Moreover, lack of repair and maintenance of this drain could have significant downstream impacts and subsequent liability for Council should any damage to our property occur as a result of flooding from this drainage system. We submitted photographic evidence of the lack of maintenance of this drain in our November submission and continue to monitor this drain closely with regular photographic records. 2, a complete lack of transparency by Council. There is a consistent pattern of lack of or late notification of any opportunities to discuss this flood study and the potential impact to our property. Most recently, we were not notified of this Council meeting on Tuesday the 9th of June to endorse the Council's report on the flood study. We contacted Council upon hearing from a neighbour last Tuesday the 2nd of June and received a reply on Friday the 5th of June confirming the upcoming meeting on the 9th of June, with the report not being uploaded for viewing until 5 p.m. that day, a Friday of a long weekend. This is also during COVID, where we are not allowed to attend the council meeting. This complete denial of any opportunity for adequate time to review and respond or consult legal and or engineering advice highlights a lack of transparency in the conduct by council in this flood study. Inaccurate reporting of our submission in the summary of submissions in the council's report, citing the difference between the incorrect 18-inch stormwater pipe size used by GRC and the correct 24-inch stormwater pipe is only by 0.05 meters.
Councillors, move to extend. Councillor Miles, Councillor Crasso, everybody in favour, please go ahead.
Only by 0.05 metres or 5 centimetres differential. It is not. The differential is 0.15 metres or 15 centimetres or 6 inches, as we advised clearly in our November submission. Critically, this differential equates to double the volume and more than double the flow volume of stormwater. This is a significant difference and would dramatically alter the flood assessment of our property, and it has been conducted, had it been conducted correctly. This again highlights a lack of transparency in the conduct by council in this flood study. We have not been advised that our property is in fact a tagged property. Rather, the letter from council on 4th of October 2019 suggests our property may be. According to the flood study, our property has been identified that flood-related development controls may apply for future development applications on our property and referenced to be listed with 187 other properties in the study at figure 34. Figure 34 appears to have been removed from the study, so we are unable to even confirm this ourselves. Again, this highlights a lack of transparency in the conduct by council in this flood study. We look forward to meaningful, fair, reasonable and transparent consultation with council on this flood study. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pattinson, for your submission. The next one is Ms. Angela Haynes. Thank you.
Also an objector, Ms. Haynes writes, my name is Angela Haynes of Huntersville, and our property has been identified in the flood study. I object to the adoption of the flood study in its current form and write to set out the reasons why and to request actions be undertaken before the flood study is adopted. The flood study has not fully taken into account of residents' concerns from submissions made, and this means that errors remain with the flood study. If this report is adopted tonight, then these errors will have a detrimental impact on the 188 properties identified. Both the council report relating to the study on pages 20 to 25 and the Floodplain Risk Management Committee minutes, pages 17 to 19, misrepresent the submissions made by residents. Submissions were made by residents of around 20 to 30 of the 188 identified properties, yet all feedback and arising actions have been described in tonight's report as not significant. This does not seem right. I believe this is erroneous, and by example, I refer you to submission number 11 on page 133 of this agenda. Submission 11 clearly articulates the need for further analysis. It is well referenced and sets out areas that the study is lacking in detail. Residents have heard nothing from council of the flood study since February, and then on the Friday before a long weekend, it is put into the meeting's agenda. It is poor form on council and feels like you are rushing this through. Actions prior to adopting the flood study. Prior to endorsement of the flood study, I request that council meet with myself and the other residents who made submissions to explain the responses to the concerns raised, as noted in the Floodplain Risk Management Committee minutes, as I do not feel they are insignificant as described in tonight's report. Also, prior to endorsement of the flood study, I request that council complete the draft action plan outlining its intentions to upgrade stormwater systems, etc. Also, as noted in the Floodplain Risk Management Committee meetings, kind regards, Angela and Matthew Haynes.
Thank you, Ms Haynes, for that presentation. The next speaker we have is Mr Peter Hawkins.
And Mr Hawkins is also an objector and states, suggested steps prior to council endorsement of flood study. Given that no changes have been made to the flood study that was placed on exhibition last year, despite numerous comments and concerns being submitted to council by residents, I suggest that prior to endorsing the flood study, council should arrange to meet with affected residents to explain the responses to the concerns raised and complete the draft action plan outlining council's intentions to upgrade stormwater systems, etc., which were both actions noted in the Floodplain Risk Management Committee minutes dated the 17th of February 2020. I therefore oppose the motion that council endorse the Hunters Hill Local Government Area flood study.
Thank you, Mr Hawkins. The next speaker we have is ex-councillor Mr Peter Astridge, OAM.
And Mr Astridge is also an objector and states, overland flow flooding report. Councillors, first of all, after all of the public meetings and consultation, we find it extremely disappointing to note that the consultants and council have totally disregarded and ignored the residents' concerns and are on a path of ramming a study through that has not addressed residents' concerns from the community meetings. The report is the same as the report originally presented in the community consultation with no amendments, which is reminiscent of the state government's push to amalgamate councils. It is pointed out in the flood study that Rocher Avenue is regarded as a hotspot where overland flooding occurs. However, Rocher Avenue is on a very steep incline and pipes collect stormwater underground from Gladesville Road and release the stormwater into Tarban Creek. Rocher Avenue did have one stormwater event through lack of council preventative maintenance, where an old, badly built, weak wall in the separation of pipes of 14 Rocher Avenue collapsed in the backyard. However, repairs were carried out on the wall after the event by council contractors, and there has never since been a problem where stormwater cannot move away. There is a big difference between water flooding retention and water movement. Even when this event occurred, the water subsided very quickly due to the steepness of the pipes and incline as soon as the rain stopped. Because of this, it is easy to understand why the consultants have misguidedly called Rocher Avenue a hotspot. At the back of the houses on the eastern side of Rocher Avenue, there is an underground stormwater pipe that carries stormwater underground from a dip in Gladesville Road down the hill to empty into Tarban Bay Creek. Also underground, alongside the stormwater pipe, is an underground spring that also carries stormwater down the steep incline. A flood means to cover or submerge an area with water. Being on a steep incline, Rocher Avenue, like many other streets in Hunters Hill, LGA, does not have that problem, as any water from any rainfall gets away or soaks into the ground as it would anywhere else. All the stormwater from the high ground goes down the stormwater drain pipe, as does the underground spring at the back of the houses on the eastern side of Rocher Avenue, emptying into Tarban Bay or Tarban Creek. There are many other steep hills and drains with stormwater pipes on the Hunters Hill Peninsula, which stretches from Pittwater Road and Victoria Road to Onions Point and includes Gladesville, Henley and Huntley's Point and Huntley's Cove, with roads which are similar to Rocher Avenue, where stormwater flows into the Parramatta or Lane Cove rivers. The flood study should be deferred to a full meeting of council where residents can have a proper say without being ignored, or the flood study should be rejected. To say Rocher Avenue is a hotspot event would be the same as saying that every incline in Hunters Hill is a hotspot, which is ridiculous. Hunters Hill cannot be compared with flat areas such as those out in the west of Sydney, as it is surrounded by two rivers and is also, as it says, a hill commonly known as a naturally raised area of land, not as high or craggy as a mountain. Or a hill is an area of land that is higher than the land that surrounds it.
Thank you, Mr. Astridge. That was, thank you, Christina. The next speaker we have is Mr. Elvis Kovacic.
Mr. Kovacic is also an objector and writes, Elvis Kovacic makes this submission in objection to the flood study on behalf of the 17 residents of Rocher Avenue who made a jointly signed submission dated the 22nd of November 2019. Per the Floodplain Development Manual, FDM 2005, Council has discretion in determining whether urban drainage problems are associated with major or local drainage, minor scale. The FDM defines major drainage as having a minimum depth in excess of 0.3 metres. I note, properties are being tagged based on stricter criteria than required under FDM 2005. In this case, 0.15 metres versus 0.3 metres. The flood study does not specify for each property lot the specific depth. It merely shows a range of 0.1 metres to 0.3 metres. Depth below the set metric should be removed from mapping so landowners can clearly see what percentage of their land is above the 0.15 metre depth, i.e. what percentage of my lot has flooding exceeding 0.15 metres. The flood study also tags properties if 10% of the lot is affected at a flood depth above 0.15 metres. Council should consider a higher percentage as the current percentage is too small. Based on tagging criteria, even properties that experience a 1 millimetre of flow depth for any length of time could be classified as a flow path. This is not pragmatic. Further, the study does not take into account of minor structures that would impact significantly on the flood flow path, e.g. brick fences, garages, pools, cabanas, shrubs, etc. Specific lot drains and pits are excluded as well from the study undertaken. Caution by Council is needed in interpreting the flood study to ensure it reflects reality and to use their experience and knowledge of the area. Indeed, there have been 2 significant rain events in recent history with no impact on residents in November of 2018 and February 2020. This shows that the flood study modelling does not reflect real-world experience. The study itself, despite omissions and inaccuracies and conservative assumptions, as noted in the resident submission on the 22nd of November 2019, made a finding that Hunters Hill has a very short critical duration, less than 45 minutes, across all flood magnitudes. As such, flooding occurs and recedes very quickly. This all supports drainage of a minor scale. Overland flooding, based on the mapping, would have minimal, if any, impact on the majority of homes in Rocher Avenue, as it would traverse to the very rear of lots and hence minimal to no internal damage could occur. I note the flow conveyance is neither deep or fast moving, and at 1.4 cubic metres per second flow rate, this discharge is not significant. Studies have shown that to be considered a flow path at all, a 2 cubic metres per second would be required. The mapping and findings of the study do not match reality and history, and a broad brush tagging of lots is disproportionate to any level of risk noted in the study. Rather, individual lots should be examined more closely for any flood risk and considered for tagging. The flood model relies heavily on historical flood data, yet the study itself has started, unfortunately, reports were very limited. The community was surveyed and only 2.5% of the 1,150 people surveyed said they experienced some form of flooding, with the majority unaware of overland flooding. In the recent heavy storm events, there was no report of flooding from Rocher Avenue residents. Other areas of concern. Blockage assumptions in the study are set at the highest rate for on-grade pits, showing a very conservative model approach. Scheduled stormwater projects are not input into the flood study. GRC staff at the focus meeting held on the 31st of October 2019 conceded that the study contains known errors with regards impervious percentages used in the model. These are detailed in the submission dated the 22nd of November 2019. We ask that Council use its discretion and call upon its experience and knowledge of the area to reject the flood study in its current form. The study lacks specific lot data. Flood model mapping does not match real-life rainfall events. The stud contains inaccuracies, errors, which GRC has admitted to and uses overly conservative assumptions. As supported by the FDM 2005, these are local drainage issues of a minor scale for which the flood development manual does not apply. We also ask Council to consider that a 1% AEP rain event is extremely improbable. The study finds very little difference between a 1% event and 5% event, which has been experienced in our history. Even in this unlikely 1% event, and despite the issues identified with the study noted above, there is still minimal impact to residents of internal flooding within Rocher Avenue Life. The cost outweighs any benefit associated with tagging properties, infrastructure upgrades, and placing additional burden on residents. Yours sincerely.
Thank you, Mr. Kovacic, and thank you to our reader. Councillors, unfortunately, 4 of our 7 councillors are unavailable for the briefing on the matter. So we've invited Steve Gray from GRC to give the councillors who are unavailable at that meeting a bit of an overview, and we'll move to that now. Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I've got a presentation here. Can you hear me? That good? Yep.
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Beautiful. I'll just get into this presentation then. All right.
See your presentation.
Thank you very much. Still good?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Yes. So this is the presentation that we gave summarising the feedback, the submissions that were submitted following the public exhibition period. Oh dear. I've just slightly changed the order of this so that we can talk about these recent storms. You just heard a variety of submissions, people talking about not experiencing flooding in the recent storms. By recent, I think they're referring to these February events. It was February the 9th. We had a lot of rainfall over that weekend. This is in 2020. Yeah, this is just before COVID sort of kicked off. Yeah, so we've got people saying, look, there was this big rainfall event. I didn't get flooded. So the study, you know, is not right. So I just want to talk about that first. What we had on the weekend is actually sort of the 7th through to the 9th. So it was around about 3 days of rainfall, certainly up at the Central Coast. That's how they experienced it. And you notice there I'm talking about the Central Coast. That's because this is a widespread event. Yeah, so this was a big rainfall event in its spatial extent. And also it was a big rainfall event in terms of the time period it occurred over. Yeah, and essentially it's an East Coast low. Right. And what we would say is that that kind of event, a long event over a big area, is going to cause floods in big river systems. And indeed it did. So in the Hawkesbury River, you can see here the Hawkesbury River, this is just indicating what that rainfall looks like in terms of probability. And so at the Hawkesbury River, this green is the 20-year event. We had almost a 20-year event. It was a bit bigger than that, or around about that at the Georges River, okay? The Cooks River running through the Marrickville area there and out near the airport. It was a slightly smaller catchment, yeah, and so we have the shorter duration for the Cooks River. But these durations here, they pertain to the catchment size. If we come across to Hunters Hill, these are the kind of catchment sizes we're talking about. So what we're saying here is that at Hunters Hill, for the kind of events that create flooding, which is relatively short events, it was not an extreme event. It was more an extreme event out at these big catchments, okay? So very small event at Hunters Hill catchment size, but for these larger catchments, it was a 10-year, it was a 20-year event type thing, okay? So we certainly didn't expect to see any flooding at Hunters Hill from that event, and neither did we. What we'd expect is from, say, a thunderstorm is a more likely cause. So moving on, this is just a graphic here, which indicates the overall floodplain risk management process that we're engaged in. Of course, we're the consultants who are running this overland flow flood study for council. This is a study that's carried out under the New South Wales state government's legislation, if you like. And the first two stages of a 5-stage process are data collection and flood study. And that's what we're doing right here. We are actually incorporating some elements from the third study, the floodplain risk management study. And that's what people in some of these submissions are referring to, that is the next stage of the study. And certainly some of the outcomes that we've got in our study sort of cross over into that area, okay? So if we just talk about the submissions that we had to the public exhibition of the flood study. So what I've got here is a map, and in the yellow, what we're seeing are submissions that were from people who were tagged, yeah? So these submissions are here from Rocher Avenue, in fact, the one that we were just talking about, that the submission referred to. Most of the submissions pertain to areas that basically in gullies, because that's where the flow paths are, okay? So what we had was we had about 23 submissions in total. I've got some numbers here. 23 registered attendees came to the meetings, yeah? We've had 14 submissions, but some of these were signed by multiple people. In fact, 2 of those 14 were signed by multiple people, Rocher Avenue being one of the examples like that. Yeah. So we've sent out letters to 188 tagged properties. All of those residents were notified by mail. We've had 2 community meetings at council, and we had 23 registered attendees for those. And we've had 14 submissions to tagging 188 properties. Okay. Now, what kind of issues were raised? Well, pretty similar issues to what's just been read out in the meeting. Yeah. But essentially, property values, insurance premiums were a very core and common concern in the submissions that were made. Yeah, there were, in smaller number, a variety of other comments made, and so they were questions about, for example, should this really be happening? Should the flood study be happening, perhaps? Yeah. How much drainage should the actual study include, and how much detail should have that study include in it? Yeah. We had witnesses, of course, residents who had said that they'd never witnessed flooding at their property. Of course, the kind of flooding we're talking about, the 1 in 100 year event, a lot of people are not going to see that in their lifetime, of course. And these are short events, which, you know, can occur any time during the day. So that wasn't necessarily something that, because somebody hadn't seen it, didn't mean that it couldn't happen. Yeah. Fundamentally, what our study has done here is looked at topographic data. So it's a topographic data that drives the outcomes of the modelling and also drives the tagging process too. And so that focus on topographic data wasn't appreciated by some because we don't include fences and walls because they can be moved and they can also fall over during an event. Yeah. There were some people who thought we should look at the mitigation before we go through the tagging. Okay, and that's something that's been raised in those submissions that I've just heard. However, the issue there, I would say, is that it's never economic to put the 100-year flood event into a pipe. And even then, we have events which are larger than the 100-year. which is really what we're trying to do here, is to isolate areas, not isolate areas, identify overland flow paths and ensure that they stay relatively open into the future, because of course we can have events bigger than the 100-year event. We did have some residents who identified that our study had very accurately emulated the flooding that they experienced at their property, and they were interested to know what kinds of mitigation measures could be put in place to help them with their issue. Yeah. Yes, so that's a summary of the submissions that we had. So if I just move forward there, so there certainly was some resistance to the tagging of lots by some of the people who were tagged. I guess what I'd like to say to council is that what we're looking at here is a means for council to identify property that should be subject to flood-related development controls so that council can discharge its responsibility. I think this method, which identified 188 properties to be tagged, is far preferable to the standard 1% flood plus half a metre definition of the floodplain area. I think that it's a lot less properties this way than that way. Yeah. During the course of the study, we were aided by the fact that in our floodplain management committee, we had Dr. Stephen Lees there. He's an expert in flooding in urban areas and in actual fact set up this sort of scheme under the New South Wales State Government, or was instrumental in doing so back in the day. So we've had very good level of supervision of the study. I think a good oversight of the methods that have been used. As I say, though, it's not entirely complicated. It really is driven by the topography. So the tagging of 188 lots means that on the 10.7 certificate, we want to say that on these properties, they should consider flood-related development controls if they're doing something on that land. Yeah, and the sole purpose of that really is to make sure that council can manage its responsibility for flooding by making sure if development occurs, it doesn't lead to some other party being worse off. That's the, yes, that's the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Gray? Thank you very much. I also believe there was a submission on that presentation on the evening by Mr. Jörg Schmidt-Lehmann, who is our legal advisor. Jörg, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me all right?
I can see you now. Thank you, Jörg. Jörg, could you just take us through what you spoke to on the evening of that presentation that some of us missed?
Certainly, I'm more than happy to do so.
Thank you.
If I may, I'll elaborate on it to some extent as well, just to try and address some of the issues that I think were raised in Steve's presentation. I think it's important to understand the context that informs the preparation of this particular report and this particular study. Firstly, I think it's relevant to identify that flood-prone land is both a valuable resource that should not be sterilised by unnecessarily precluding its development, and that if all development applications and proposals for rezoning of flood-prone land are assessed according to a rigid prescriptive criteria, some appropriate proposals may not reach a successful conclusion. The primary objective of the policy is to reduce the impact of flooding and flood liability on individual owners and occupiers of flood-prone property, and to reduce private and public losses resulting from floods using ecologically sustainable and positive methods wherever possible. That's for a range of measures, which include providing technical support from the state government to councils in ensuring that management of flood-prone land is consistent with flood risks, with the principles set out and the guidelines provided in the floodplain management plan. Now, it's important to understand that the management of flood-prone land is primarily the responsibility of council. The policy provides for a merit-based approach to the selection of appropriate flood planning levels, and it's important to appreciate that the manual to which I refer, the Floodplain Management Manual 2005, is an update on the 2001 Floodplain Management Manual, which was designed to reflect significant changes in the role of state agencies, and it replaces the 1986 Floodplain Development Manual for the management of flood liable land in accordance with Section 733 of the Local Government Act. Now, I raise that point because effectively Council has the protection under Section 733 of the Local Government Act by way of indemnities granted to Council if it acts in good faith in carrying out certain functions when it comes to floodplain management. The process that's outlined in the Floodplain Management Manual is specifically designed to address that particular requirement. It involves 5 steps that Steve has referred to. The first 2 steps have been completed, and effectively they involve the collection of data and the preparation of the flood study, which defines the nature and extent of the flood problem in a technical rather than map form, and is one that has been undertaken by Steve in this process. Now, it's a comprehensive technical investigation of flood behaviour. It determines hydraulic and hazard categories within the floodplain for the potential range of flood and land use scenarios in order to consider its cumulative effects. What we have at this point in time is not a decision by way of introducing development controls for properties that have been tagged in this particular report. And certainly it is not a report that provides a definitive outcome in terms of development controls. It's merely flagging that there are certain properties which have been tagged, 188 properties, that may in future, once we have developed a flood risk management study and developed a plan and then choose to implement it, that may then be subject to those development controls. So at this stage, we don't have a plan. We have a study. That study has been undertaken with the advice from the department, with technical assistance, and it involves the expertise and views expressed by Council's consultant. Moving forward, one of the issues that was raised was a question about the identification of this particular report, and I think it's appropriate for the purposes of transparency to ensure that we don't look at changing the scope or the title of the report, because it deals with precisely the subject matter identified in the report, and that is the idea of flooding, and in this instance, the primary impact of flooding on the Hunters Hill Council local government area relates to overland flows. In terms of the recording of information in Council's planning certificates, and that is really where Council is exercising its good faith obligations in providing information to parties that obtain the information from Council's planning certificates, it's important to identify that at this stage, no properties are subject to development controls. At this stage, we have identified properties that may in the future be subject to development controls, and those development controls can only be determined once we've prepared a flood risk management study, flood management risk study, and prepared the plan and then intended to implement it. And that goes in tandem with the development of the council policy on floodplain risk management. So in short, I think it's important to understand that we can put to ease the minds of parties that are concerned by the tagging of their properties, that at this stage, no development controls have as yet been identified. However, Council has an obligation as part of this 5-step process, of which only 2 steps have been completed, to ensure that it does address the objectives of the state government's floodplain policy, so that it can ensure that it has the protection under Section 733 of the Local Government Act in moving forward with the identification of properties that may in future be subject to flood-related development controls.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt-Lehmann. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Schmidt-Lehmann? Councillor Williams. Just one moment, sorry, Councillor.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Mayor. I mistakenly put my hand up. I apologise.
That's all right. No trouble. Thank you. Councillors, do any councillors have any? Councillor McLaughlin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It may not be directed to Mr. Schmidt-Lehmann directly, but either he could answer it or perhaps the General Manager. We've completed step 2, which is the flood study. We have the further steps to come, including the floodplain risk management study. Do those other studies, are they going to be the subject of further community consultation?
General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, they are. I'll ask the Director to outline the consultation that goes with that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, there would be further consultation. We'll start with consulting DPI and put together a plan together with the consultants that will be engaged for that stage.
Any further questions, Councillor?
Well, just, I guess the fundamental question is we are statutorily obliged to provide a floodplain risk management manual by the state government. There's no way we can avoid not doing this or avoid doing this.
General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and I'll ask Mr. Schmidt-Lehmann to add to this. Our advice from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment is that there are only 2 councils in metropolitan Sydney who do not have an adopted flood plan, and it's best practice to have one. Mr. Schmidt-Lehmann, would you like to add to that?
Yes, certainly. Through you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, General Manager, Ms. Campbell. I think it's important to appreciate that there is an obligation on the council to implement this particular state government policy through the adoption ultimately of a floodplain management plan. The next step is the identification and preparation of a flood risk management study. And the purpose of that study is to identify and assess as well as compare various risk management options and to consider opportunities for environmental enhancement mitigation works. That then precedes the development of the floodplain risk management plan, whose purpose is to provide input into the strategic and statutory planning role of the council. So what we have is we have an obligation on the council to ensure that when it exercises its statutory planning roles, that it is able to refer to an appropriate plan that has taken into consideration this particular report, as well as the subsequent flood risk management study, so that it can then prepare and implement appropriate development controls that manage the development of land within the Hunters Hill LGA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillors, any further questions?
Councillor Sanderson.
Councillor Sanderson, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've looked at the study pretty carefully as an engineer, and I do have a few concerns. So there are a few minor errors. There are other things that I think that have been pointed out in some of the submissions will lead to a lack of confidence in some parts about the submission. Do you see any harm at this point in time, us taking the time to clarify some of those problems so that we better inform our community about this process so that everyone can have far more confidence in it? May delay it a short time, but do you see any problem with that delay?
General Manager.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a matter for the council to decide that, Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you.
General Manager, do we have any deadlines approaching on this matter?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, my understanding is that we need to have something in place by October. The Director may wish to add to that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we have a funding deadline from DPI to report back by October. That's the current deadline we're working towards.
Councillor Sanderson.
A further question. when you say a further deadline, what is it we have to achieve by October?
Director.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, a completed study is to achieve the 2/3 funding we've got from DPI.
When you say a completed study, do you mean the study we're wanting to endorse tonight, or is this something further down the track?
Through the Director.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's stage 2. That's the current study you're looking at.
So just to clarify that stage 2 has to be in by October.
For the funding, that's the current funding deadline.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any further questions of the two experts we have with us this evening, councillors? All right. So I'll go back to the recommendation there to move Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Sanderson.
No.
Yeah, waiving Councillor Sanderson, or?
No, I'm waiving, Mr. Mayor. I'm not moving that motion. I'm moving an alternate motion which I provided to yourself and the General Manager this morning, which I hope has been circulated to the other councillors.
Okay, just one moment, Councillor Williams. I'll come straight back. Councillor Miles.
Mr. Mayor, just seconding that circulated motion.
Okay. So can we bring up the motion that Councillor Williams sent through this afternoon? I did see that earlier, Councillor Williams.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was sent in early today.
Okay.
Would you like me to read it out?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The council receive and note the report. The council notes that the flood risk management guidelines are not prescriptive and allow council flexibility to tailor its response to suit local conditions. 3, council notes the Hunters Hill municipality has a highly variable topography, making it reasonable for council to consider the individual circumstances faced by property owners rather than imposing a single criteria or a generic threshold that triggers inclusion as floodplain. Part 4, council acknowledges that the study identifies overland flow as a predominant potential impact for the majority of properties, with only 5 being subjected to rising water, which is what is traditionally called flooding. Council does, number 5, council does not include at this stage on a notation on 10.7 bracket 5 and 2 certificates under the EMPA Act, with the exception of the 5 properties impacted by flooding, rising water, until council has completed its flood risk management study. It is considered unreasonable to tag properties at this stage as there is still uncertainty. The properties are impacted and what planning controls could be imposed. 6, council in conjunction with property owners conduct further investigations to assess the relevance of the threshold used in the study, which is 10% of the property to a depth of 150 mils or greater during a 1 in 100 year rainfall event, to individual properties and circumstances experienced with overland flow in the Hunters Hill municipality. And 7, council seek advice from the relevant state government agency as to the approach above and its conformance with the objectives of the flood risk management guidelines.
Okay. Could we have councillors back on screen? So for the motion moved by Councillor Williams, is there a seconder? Councillor Miles. Councillor Williams, would you like to speak to that? Could I also point out in about 10 minutes time, we're going to have a short break. You have 5 minutes.
I think I can achieve it in 10 minutes, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, you have 5 minutes, Councillor.
Yeah, I know. This has been a very contentious issue in our community, and as the chair of the council committee, I've lived and breathed it now for 18 months and seen the issues that are being raised by residents. At the onset of my presentation or my talking to the motion, I make it very clear that this motion does not move away from council's responsibilities in any fashion to meet the government's requirements in terms of developing a plan in relation to the requirements. But what it does do is recognise that there is flexibility in what council can do under this process. And we are only at stage 2 of a 5-part stage. So it's not unreasonable for council, considering the rather unique circumstances which we find ourselves in because of our topography and because of our the way rain falls and moves through our landscape, to take a moment to just reflect on where we're at and to make sure that before we tag people's properties, we don't create undue concern and undue stress. And I think that was mentioned by the legal advisor, that the whole intent of this process is not to sterilise land. It's not to cause undue stress and affect the well-being of landholders. And it's evident through this process. And as you can expect, it's evident in any time this sort of process is conducted. People do concern about their property values. They do concern about their insurance premiums. And to put a question mark over our residents without knowing exactly the outcome, whether they're going to be included, it's all about may and what conditions will be placed on their property, virtually puts them in limbo for whatever period it takes for council to get to the next stage. I think there's been enough questions about the relevance of the study to Hunters Hill. And we have, the consultants have done their process, and I don't dispute that. But it's a process that really is cookie cut from a whole range of other exercises that have been done with councils with a far different topography, far different outcome. And we saw at the start of the presentation from the consultant that it's highly variable in Sydney. What is a 1 in 20 year storm, wherever it was in Blacktown, the same rainfall event in Hunters Hill is a minor event. So things respond differently in our neighbourhood, and we are talking about overland flow. We're not talking about flooding, which is the predominant reason why the government brought in this requirement and legislation, because we saw lives lost and large tracts of land, whether it's as far as Tweed Heads or Blacktown or wherever, being inundated by rainfall, causing risk to life and property. The circumstances in Hunters Hill is quite different, and I think we need to reflect on that and respect that and use the flexibility that's allowed to us during this process to bring our community along with us. And so in part 6 of the motion is clearly an opportunity for council to re-engage with its community, with those that are potentially affected, and work through exactly what the impact is on their property. Because I think it's worth the effort to investigate rather than just blanketly put 10% of their property as a basis for the whole property. That could be the chook yard down the back corner of their property, and the whole property is now labelled in their building footprint. Like Rocher Avenue is a classic example, extremely steep topography. The water obviously flows across the bottom of those properties, does not impact on the dwellings that are on that site. So the 10% rule or threshold, to me, needs to be considered further. And we're talking about 6 inches of water. It does not pose an enormous risk to life or property. It may be more in some places, and I know there are some residents that probably would feel it's appropriate to have their properties tagged in this way, so that ultimately they get priority to get some relief through infrastructure programs. So there still is a mixed view out there, but I think council needs to take a step and pause and go through a process which it does have available to us, which is a level of flexibility in this process. And I might add that I think it's inappropriate to refer to Dr. Lees as being an oversighter of the report. He was a community representative and he was
Councillor
not a
Williams,
professional.
you've actually exceeded your 5 minutes. Are you almost finished?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, but I would like a little bit more if I could.
I move to extend. Councillor McLaughlin, Councillor Stanison, all in favour. That's carried. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The other issue that's been raised is the relevance of the modelling to our circumstance. And the 2015 Floodplain Management Association National Conference stated that the reliability and accuracy of flood models in areas experiencing low flows and or depths is limited, as these models do not always appropriately take into account minor structures such as fences, buildings, landscaping, etc., which can have significant impacts on the flow paths and local overland flooding. So it's all well to say that these things are transient. A fence could be there today and gone tomorrow. The place could change its retaining walls and things. That's fair enough, but the fact is that at the sort of flow levels we're talking about in Hunters Hill, they play an enormous part in where the water goes and the impact it may or may not have. So we're not unique, but we do have a lot of factors in Hunters Hill that require us to be careful and take a process that brings along people rather than like the statement in the report here that sort of says feedback from the community consultation and arising actions are not significant, therefore the exhibition is not required. To me, that is a slap in the face of people that have come to council with their concerns in good faith. I think we need to meet our obligations, which we can, as has been indicated. We're only at stage 2 of a 5-part process. I think we can acknowledge that we do have rather different circumstances than what would be experienced by councils that or council areas that are heavily impacted by flooding, which is rising water, whereas we're impacted predominantly by overland flow, which has a totally different characteristic, totally different risk factor associated with our communities. And I would expect us to work with our community to be able to tease out with those properties what portions of them are or are not impacted rather than a blanket approach across the whole area. And I understand that some councils have adopted one in, all in, that their whole municipality or city is labelled rather than just one or two. You can also take approaches of zones rather than individual property tagging. So there's still a bit of work to be done, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Could you remind me who the seconder was?
Mr. Miles. Councillor Miles.
Councillor Miles, thank you. It was too. Thank you, Councillor Miles. Could I suggest it's 7:58 at the moment. Could I suggest we just take a break, hold the questions and come back in 5 minutes? Councillor Crassoy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Could I just ask that we be sent these amendments because they weren't circulated and they're extensive. So I would like to take my 5 minutes to read them, if you wouldn't mind.
Good suggestion. All right, we'll send them to you now, if we can.
Yep, through you, Mr. Mayor. It should be in your inbox.
Just gone to you now. We'll come back in 5 minutes and you'll still have some time to look through them in 5 minutes' time. Thank you, councillors. Be back at 5 minutes past 8 and viewers.